Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Inspired in Berlin podcast. My guest today is Merissa Silk. Merissa is a product leader with 15 years of experience. She's most passionate about customer-centric methodologies to bring new products to market. Her career has included positions in Sydney, New York, Berlin. She's currently working remotely from Berlin as a staff product manager at Onfido. We'll talk a bit about that as well. In her free time, Merissa enjoys supporting female founders and other women in tech with career development and coaching. This is something that I'm really interested in. I think we'll have a lot to talk about that. But first, Merissa, welcome.
Thanks very much for having me. I'm super happy to be on the podcast today.
Me too. I think if I could show you my table setup here, I've got about 10 sticky notes with various notes on them. But let's start with your recent developments in your career. I've been following you on LinkedIn, and I see that you share a lot of really useful content. You seem to be coaching a lot of people. You seem to be involved in a lot of initiatives, especially with women in tech and so on top of having your full-time job, which is also not just something that you're starting on. How do you manage all this? What drives you?
Yeah, so I probably spend too much time on professional activities, but especially with the pandemic, a lot of us, like myself included, are spending more time inside and maybe more time in front of a computer. And so I've tried to use that in a productive way and try and give back a bit to the community. When I started in product management, there weren't so many women in tech. There weren't so many women in product. And I think, feel motivated to try and be the kind of mentor and support system that I didn't have when I was a young PM living in New York.
What's the best part of that? Is it something where are you helping people solve their problems, or is it just kind of sharing your knowledge and experience and seeing where that takes them?
So it's a bit of both, actually, and I honestly prefer the conversations where I'm helping people sort of talk through their challenges at work sort of together so that we can come up with a way for them to, for example, prepare for a performance review or ask for a raise or a promotion or try to figure out ways to bring discovery into their teams or how to manage when they don't have a design resource. These are many topics that have come up time and time again in my recent mentoring sessions. Of course, some people are interested in pivoting into product or maybe pivoting away from product, and they want to ask me sort of personal questions about my career and what their options might be. Those conversations are fine, but they're not my favorite. I really like when someone sort of brings me a challenge in their day-to-day work and I help them talk it through.
Sweet. I'm wondering if there's enough material on this on the internet, or is that too much noise and that's why people need somebody with experience to talk to? Or do you refer people to certain tried and true methods?
Well, maybe you found this in your coaching experience as well, but sometimes it's really hard to take a really theoretical kind of thing and then figure out how that works in your own workplace. And I think that there is sort of a gap because a lot of the stuff that is on the internet isn't that pragmatic or doesn't say this is how you could adapt this if you're having X, Y, or Z context, or if you're not set up in an empowered team, this is how you sort of bring product thinking into the space. And so I haven't written a ton of content myself, but in the few things that I have put on Medium, I really tried to be super pragmatic and say it's okay if you don't live in, Marty Kagan's Inspired. This is sort of how you can, become an awesome product manager and have big influence within your organization and help people to shift their mindset in a really practical way. And this is sort of the mindset that I also bring into my sort of mentoring sessions.
So digging a bit further into that, in the last couple of years, I think I've been focusing way too much on the collaboration aspect of product management and not on the methods. But it is also something where I don't find too much let's say, material that you can follow on the internet. There's a lot about agile, and there's a lot about different methodologies, and everybody talks about negotiation skills, but nobody really tells you, hey, at the end of the day, it's about people, and you have to deal with people with all sorts of experiences and issues. Isn't that what it comes down to, kind of like the relationships within teams?
So 100%. Of course, like when I started in my career, product management was still kind of new. I sort of came up in New York and not on the West Coast. So, I was working in companies that had a really small digital team, and we definitely like weren't working agile. I didn't even like know what agile was. I barely even knew what product management was, because back then we were called like producers or production managers or project managers. But ultimately, for me, like even early days, I could see that without any training, breaking down silos and helping people talk to each other and communicating through like a shared language and a shared vision and set of goals was a better way to get stuff done. And so even at like 22 or 23 years old, like I was given big projects that were worth a lot of money, because suddenly like I was the person in the team that was like making all my deadlines, and people were really happy, and suddenly like everyone was talking to one another. And this was just like a really natural sort of way of working for me, because, it's sort of, if you think about like a physical office, right, things were really different 15 years ago. There was no like remote work. And so if you think about like the way things were organized, like physically in a space, like back then it was even like pre-open floor plan offices. And so physically, like we were separated by like literal barriers in the office. And maybe, the office was sort of shaped. I remember my first office was sort of like shaped like a hallway. And so like one person in the team was sitting like on one end, and the other person was sitting like many steps away from the other person. And so in order to get our projects done, I really had to physically bring people together and insist that they sit next to each other and talk to one another and sort of like review the different steps in the project as a group. And this kind of was like never done before, at least not in the company where I was working. So I agree with you. I mean, you can see from my resume that I've jumped jobs many times and many companies. I've worked in lots of different sizes and shapes of orgs and teams. And the first thing that I do is try and make an assessment of like who is and isn't talking to whom, like how information flows across the organization. And in like 99% of cases, I try to fix the ways of working first before I even bother with any product related topics. So I'm with you. I think you're totally right.
Wow, there's so much in there. But focusing a bit on the relationships topic and making some of those changes, right? And I learned a lot from my first first real job, which was with a company based in San Francisco. I was in Pakistan, but it really kind of implicitly, to me, taught me the American way of working. And to this day, I feel like I have the American work ethic, which boils down to getting things done. So, if we need to get something done, I'm gonna fight with you. I'm gonna negotiate with you. I'm gonna be on the case, and I'll respond to my emails and so on. And this is something that I for sure see is very different in Europe. In Europe, the not to make it any smaller or denigrated, but I get the feeling it's just a job kind of mindset. So even when people kind of care, we don't seem to have this cultural background of solving problems together and doing whatever it takes to do that. How's your feeling about that, and how does that make you feel? Because for me, it still hurts.
Well, I mean, it feels really great for me to hear you say that, because this has been like a major pain point for me since coming to Europe. I really, like I said, I feel really like collaborative by nature. I believe that building software is a team sport. I really feel that way. And, like for me, I really love to work in these kinds of trios, like an engineer and like on one side, a designer on the other side, and the three of us kind of work cross-functionally and make decisions together, and we fight for things from our differing perspectives. And that's really like what I'm used to. And I can say that kind of spirit is not always appreciated here. And it's been really challenging for me. I mean, I imagine it's been a challenge for you too.
Absolutely. But I've been working a lot on this, and especially now as a coach as well, but previously leading teams. I think it always kind of came down to it really is just a cultural difference. It's not that people are evil or something. Because the first time I got hit with this, so I went from Pakistan to Singapore and then Singapore to Germany. And Singapore still has a lot of American influence, different backgrounds, but it worked well for me. Coming to Germany, it really hit me. And then over the years, it's kind of like, I just need to get people to that point where we can all say, hey, we actually do want to get things done. We might just have certain habits that are not conducive to moving things forward. And we might have different expectations. But that is, once you get to that point, I think things move a bit faster. But still, there is a difference, and you kind of also modulate your pace. So there are certain things that I don't do the way I used to do. Sometimes I do not respond to an email. And when we were exchanging, it really reminded me of this thing of, hey, you're responding to the emails like almost immediately. No other guest does this. That's how it used to be. But isn't that amazing? And I want to take this to the other part, because one of the things that I learned from that way of working was that I developed a sort of affinity or care for my work. And I can say today that I really love my job, whatever it is that I do, because I get a lot of that. And I feel that's another very American thing.
It really is. I mean, I think, like Americans, like, are all about their work. Actually, like so I left the US in 2014. I moved first to Sydney and then to Germany. So I also had like a multi-step path, like you did. And I think for me, like, especially when I arrived in Australia, I felt super disoriented because my entire like sense of myself, my entire identity was wrapped up in like being a product manager. I didn't have hobbies. I didn't have free time. I had been working at a newspaper. I literally had been working 24/7 for 2 years. So wow. I didn't have anything besides product management. And I really defined myself like that. And suddenly I got to this place where people, like surfed and spent time with family and had all of these hobbies and did all these outdoor things. And I was kind of like, what is happening? And people, came to work at 9 and they left at 5 and they didn't work in the evenings or on the weekend. My bosses were telling me, hey, Merissa, like, it's slower here. You can respond slower. Like, you can say I'm at a good stopping point at the end of the day and you can go home and not think about this. And I like really needed someone to explain this to me because I had never seen anything like it before. And it was very, very different. But I think the thing for me that still like really resonated even in that environment. So for one, it was like a big personal shift, and I had to try to figure out like who I was if I wasn't a product manager, and what was important to me and my values. But I think for me, like really what I realized that I was looking for in a workplace is like a sense of openness, because New Yorkers are people who complain. I mean, maybe you've watched Seinfeld, but New Yorkers are people who complain, and they're a bit shouty and they're a bit forceful, and this is kind of what I'm like, a lot of the time. But the thing is that people where I come from, are really also like very open to change. People aren't just complaining to complain, which is different from a lot of cultures that are just kind of complainy, but people are complaining with the aim of like making a difference. Yeah. And this is sort of like an ingrained value. And so, when I moved to Australia, people sort of time boxed their work and they defined their persona in different ways. But at the end of the day, people wanted to hear what I had to say. They wanted to learn from the experiences I had brought over from the US. They were very open to trying new things. And they were really willing to say, hey, Merissa, like, we're willing to try whatever you want for, a sprint, for example, for 2 weeks. And then, we'll make use of the retro and we'll evaluate whether or not it was working. And then we'll, decide if we, stay or make a change or continue or whatever. And I really loved that. So for me here in Germany, when I came here, the pace is slower. People don't define themselves by their work, but I also really was missing, honestly, that kind of openness. So I also learned through this process to be less forceful and less pushy and to try to sort of bring one change at a time instead of 10. But, I really haven't in my time here, I've struggled to be able to get that buy-in where I'm like, can't we try it for 2 weeks? Like, that's really like nothing in the scheme of things. Like, if we don't like it, we never have to do it again. And I just struggle really to get people on board. Have you found a way through this kind of sort of closed-mindedness?
I think for me, it came down to what you were just saying, that, people have different experiences and different backgrounds, and every experience sort of reinforces something or settles something in you. It is our also being human beings. We are kind of like learning new things, and we want to get them to a point where it goes on autopilot. So obviously there's a dominant narrative that you came from, and you faced a different dominant narrative over here. For me, it actually highlighted the other aspects of being a product manager. So this is how I define it now, or rationalize it now, that, if we were all moving in the same direction with the same mindset, we will be way faster, and we would experiment a lot, and we would learn a lot, and we would challenge each other. But we do not have that experience yet. So every person is going to perceive it as a threat. The further away they are from that experience, they're going to feel that it's a threat. So I have to go to the other side of product management and focus on this whole thing. Again, it comes to that thing of everybody talks about stakeholder management, but what does that mean in practice? You got to work with people with all sorts of mindsets. You got to work with the CEO who was never questioned in their life before. You got to work with the engineer who just wants to code. And you have to build those relationships. So I'm focusing so much on that now, because all the other good practices, I'm like, okay, we're going to compromise on the roadmap. We're going to compromise on Jira versus walls and sticky notes. I just want to make sure that you're still talking to me.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, for sure. And I think that you're right, that sometimes as product people, we're so used to bringing empathy when we talk to our users or talk to the people who are going to be interacting with our product. And I think sometimes, myself included, we forget to apply that same level of empathy to the rest of the people that we have to work with, because that's exactly what you're talking about. Trying to sort of think, okay, where is this person coming from, and what's their mindset like, and how might they perceive this kind of interaction, and trying to find a way forward that allows them to want to be part of it. And truthfully, sometimes this is an area where I struggle. So I really I appreciate you calling that out.
It takes a lot of work, and as I said, personally, I'm going to be very honest. There are still many occasions where it really hits me hard, but then I have to take a step back and go okay, if I think from a product manager's perspective, what is my product, and why is this person not buying that product? I know that it's going to solve a problem for them. I know it's good for them, but they're not buying it. So there's something I need to work on. I need to work on my marketing. There's something with our branding. And I had a very interesting example. Recently, I was talking to somebody, one of my coaches, and I said a couple of times, all right, that sounds like an engineering problem. And it triggered him. But luckily, we noticed this, and we talked about it. And I was like, when I say it's an engineering problem, what I mean is that engineering can solve that problem. Nobody else can. Other people can support and talk about it, but I think we were talking about quality issues and bug fixing and test automation. And the way I see those two things is just do it. Everybody else can tell you how to manage this, but you're the only people who can solve it. And this was such a nice little eye-opening experience that, that for that person, that sounds like a blame. For me, it's just a statement of fact where I'm like, okay, let's establish that this is an engineering problem, and then we go ahead and try to fix that together. So there's a lot of those moments where kind of coming back to that part again and again of how do I say this that this person gets it? That it is part of also my job to figure that out has helped me a lot.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely been a focus for me, especially in the last couple of years. I think when I first came to Berlin, I was kind of under the impression that brute force was going to get me through, and you might have expected that wasn't the best. That wasn't the best style or approach, but that's what sometimes New Yorkers are like, and I didn't know any better. And I really think that like this kind like sentiment, like you said, about sort of packaging something up in a way so that the other person not just wants to hear it, but wants to receive it. That's a real skill. That's a real skill. And I think that for product people, we definitely don't talk about that one enough.
No, and it takes a lot of work. Talking of New York, I'm a big fan of George Carlin. I think he was one of the best products coming out of New York. And that's my only reference to New York. I've been following him and listening to all his HBO specials, and I got a couple of his books up there. And he went through this this transformation in his career as well. I think early on in his career, he was getting some TV gigs, and he had to do things the way people told him to. He had to wear a suit and tell some jokes, and there was some point in his career where he found his voice. And not only found his voice, which initially went against a lot of people, but also found a way to kind of do very precise and hard-hitting social commentary in his HBO specials with all of America and the rest of the world watching. And this was something really interesting for me that, especially as product managers, and especially once you start leading teams, you kind of get a whole laundry list of things you still have to do. Self-motivation. It's a term I'm still kind of just scratching the surface of. I used to put it on my CV, way back when we had CVs. I was like, I'm a self-motivated individual with very good problem-solving abilities. I'm just starting to learn what self-motivation means. And negotiation skills and communication and taking initiatives. It's an amazing journey, but I want to hear from you. How do you feel about these topics? Like, do you feel there are times where you have to motivate yourself day in and day out to get something done?
I mean, for sure, product management is a hard job, and it's hard for reasons that I think maybe that aren't like so out in the open. It feels very glamorous, right? You're this person who makes decisions. You're kind of a maker, but you're also kind of a leader. And, there aren't that many jobs that allow you to sort of like juggle those functions. But it's really tough. Like, you're in the line of fire. Like, everyone is looking at you 100% of the time, asking questions, needing information. If something goes wrong, it's on you. If something goes well, you don't get the credit, the team does. Like, it's kind of thankless, honestly, like a lot of the time. I remember like early days, there was this article, I think it was in the Next Web, like more than 10 years ago. There was kind of like product managers are like the janitor of a team. And like, honestly, like that really resonated for me. It stuck with me all these years later, because if something doesn't like neatly fall in a different sort of functions, sort of small box remit, it's yours. Like if you don't have a designer in the team, great, you're doing design work. If you don't have a tester in the team, great, you're doing that too. If you, need a project manager or a scrum master or an agile coach or product marketing. I've worn all of those hats. It's like, needing 10 arms.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of work to be done. And the thing is that it's kind of like never ending. So this kind of concept from Australia about sort of like finding a stopping point is kind of a thing that I think as a product manager is a skill that you need to be able to have. You need to be able to like ruthlessly prioritize your own tasks and figure out how to keep the team and your sort of collaborators moving forward, and somehow find a way to like stop working in the evening. And all of these things, all of these challenges, like if you're not intrinsically motivated to do work and to enable people and to build good products, like this job will eat you alive. I'm sure of that.
No, absolutely. This need to wear multiple hats. There are situations that put you in all of that. I've had to do this in my last job where I wrote a bit of code I had to design, and while we didn't have our CTO, I had to negotiate technical things with people who apparently were more qualified than me to make those decisions. And there was also this kind of sense of, I almost had to negotiate with myself over and over again, and finding those points where it's like, now I'm putting on the product manager hat, and now I need to take a break. It's a lot of emotional labor.
Absolutely. And this point about like negotiating with yourself is a great one. So constantly, right? Like again, I will say that like so many of us don't live in Marty Kagan's inspired. This is the reality of being a PM. And the truth is that like that means that things are going to be less than ideal like most of the time, which means that you are in a position where you have to negotiate with yourself. And, you know, sometimes I have to sort of like talk to myself like, okay, Merissa, is this really like the hill you want to die on? Is this really like the level of detail you want to go into? Is this really like a decision you can't live with? Is this really, you know, a problem for your product? And it really is this kind of like circular kind of like thought process inside my head where I probably spend as much time negotiating with my own self and my own thoughts as I do with other people.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, none of that gets acknowledged, right?
Yeah, nobody sees that argument you're having in your own mind.
No, absolutely. And this brings me to the other part, coaching. You know, you're coaching people outside your organization as well. I would love to hear more how that is going, but also almost this need to coach other people, to at least have some sort of inkling of how you think and the challenges you have to face and the process behind coming to these decisions. Because oftentimes you would have to justify your decisions on why is this UI good enough and you don't want to spend more time on this? Why do you actually need to spend on the opposite side of it? Why do you actually need to talk to a bunch of users and justify a whole lot of things? And there's this need to coach your teams into this kind of product mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually this like wasn't a skill set that came naturally to me at all. It was something that I had to learn and teach myself because I saw that it was like necessary to be successful. So early days in my product career, like there were a lot of people making decisions without having to kind of socialize them. That's how I will put it politely. And again, when I moved to Sydney, I worked in org where in this kind of culture where it was like probably as important, maybe even more important to bring people on the journey with you as it was to like deliver. And I really like wasn't used to this at all. Like this was like the opposite of the cultures I was used to back home. And so suddenly I found myself in a position where I constantly had to explain and I had to like figure out how to engage people and I had to help them to understand why we were making decisions and why we weren't doing things in a different way. And I really like honestly like lacked the vocabulary for this because again, like I hadn't had Scrum training or Agile training. Product management was kind of new when I started my career. I didn't have other product people around to learn from. And so early days, I asked if they could send me for Scrum training.
Oh, wow.
And like, you know, the truth is that like I already knew how to do the job. I had been doing it for like, you know, more than 5 years at that point. But I didn't have the words to talk about the job.
Yeah.
And I think that for me, like that's what the Scrum training really did. It gave me a vocabulary to explain this is how and why I made those decisions and to be able to like bring all of these colleagues like on this journey and to explain where we were coming from. And that it was like okay to move slower in order to get that kind of buy-in. And so it was like really this skill that I had to like purposefully cultivate in order to function in this really big org. I had also never worked in a company of that size and scale. But it served me very well. And it's also like helped me like, you know, help other product people. I'm still like learning. I'm still trying to figure out like when a thing needs to be explained versus not actually like sort of being able to identify that moment where you say, this person is not coming on this journey with me and I need to talk them through it. I'm still like learning how to spot those moments. But I definitely think that because it was a skill that I had to learn myself, it's a little bit easier for me to help other people build that skill because I remember what it was like rather than something that like, when something comes naturally to you, it's like really hard to like coach another person how to do the thing because you don't really understand how or why you do that thing. But for something like this, I feel like I've really tried to help a lot of product people and sort of say like, okay, it's great that you made this set of decisions and it's great that sort of in your mind you understand how and why you did these things, but how are you going to explain it to somebody else? And do you understand like why you need to explain it to someone else? And do you, you know, have a sense of like why you got the kind of pushback you got? Like, let's help you find a way through it. And so I think that because I had to learn it myself, I think that's made me able to help people better.
Hmm. Do you think there's certain advantage to just starting with certain frameworks, or this kind of first principles way of thinking or discovering things for yourself is what you would recommend, or is it a mix?
I don't know. I mean, so what's really funny is like when I get mentees, for example, who want to break into product management now, they're either early career or they want to pivot. Like, I actually like don't know how to tell them like precisely how to get started. In most cases, what I suggest is that, you know, they take a role that leverages the skill sets that they have that are adjacent to product, and then through that role take on more and more and more product responsibilities. And the way that you can do this is by being really good at spotting opportunities. So if you see that like a new project is coming up or a piece of work isn't covered, put your hand up and say, hey, could I do this? And then you sort of get to start doing the product job while you're doing something else. And I think that for me, like, this is the best way to learn how to do that job. So yeah, I do think that like people should read books and get under, you know, sort of some frameworks underway, but this is a job that you get good at by doing it. And if you don't create the opportunities for yourself to be able to like round out your own skill set, you know, you're not going to get good at the job. I really believe this. So for me, like in a lot of mentoring sessions, I also heavily lean on Ravi Mehta's What's Your Shape article. I think a lot, like, I don't know if you've read this, but
I haven't yet.
It's awesome, and it sort of like helps you measure your skills against, I think, like 12 core competencies that product managers need. And he kind of gives this sort of example to say, okay, like if you're this flavor of skills, then you might be this kind of PM, or you should go after this kind of work. And if you're this combination of skills, you could be like this kind of PM. And also from that article, there's a bunch of downloads for really specific information. But I think it helps to kind of say, okay, like, these are the skills that you need to be great PM. Like, where are you? Where do you want to be? And then like help them sort of identify moments where they can like round out that skill set so that they can become great PMs. I really do think that you need to like roll up your sleeves. If you're a person who like doesn't like to get your hands dirty, product management is not for you.
That's a fair point, and I think there's a lot of wisdom behind that, right? Isn't that also the heart of Agile, right? There are many things that you can only figure out once you start doing them, so you don't have to waste too much time. You know, kind of being pragmatic about prep versus getting on with it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so I'm a person who likes to like be thoughtful about things, but somehow this kind of like just enough mindset like also really resonates. So I tried to do like just enough prep so that I can do the next step or someone else can do the next step, and then we sort of do just enough prep so that we can do the next step and the next step. And this like, you know, some of these like kind of scrummy principles like really like make sense for me, right? You kind of like time box, you do just enough, you sort of enable people, you sort of just, this is how I push forward.
Indeed. And on this part about becoming the kind of or figuring out what kind of product manager you are, there's one interesting distinction I'm starting to make in my career, where kind of almost half the products or a bit more that I've done in the last 10 years were things that we started from scratch. And I feel like I've gotten really good at that part. You know, if you have an idea, like, I don't feel any doubts that we can make it happen. You know, the discovery process, starting with an MVP, figuring out where to draw the line, getting started with some guerrilla user testing and so on. There's a whole bunch of things that I've kind of picked up over the years and practiced, that I'm like, no brainer, easy. And then there's the part about actually working on and maintaining a running product, where you have established user base and you kind of know that you're growing 1% year on year, and that's okay for management. You know, people are set in their ways. That's where I still get a bit triggered, because I guess the majority of that experience of discovering new things and making things happen comes into clash with the stability of something that is running. And then I can imagine this is the part that I haven't yet done, which is taking established product and growing it beyond imagination. So kind of disrupting that stability on purpose. Do you see kind of these differences as well?
Absolutely. And my career has been very similar to yours in that like I've almost only worked on brand new products. So
wow.
This is also where I like to live. I think I'm good at it. It also like drives me. The kinds of challenges when you have like a million unknowns are ones that I can handle, I think, better than some of my peers. At least that's sort of like what I've observed. And I found that that was a way that I could differentiate myself quite early days in my career because I wasn't afraid of all of those unknowns. I liked sitting in the discomfort of unknowns longer than most people. So my career has also followed that path. I did have some experience with some like growth hacking, trying to like optimize or revamp experiences. And I think a lot of the sort of new product skills that I had were transferable in that way. The thing is that like when you're trying to like look for new jobs or new opportunities, if you've only, or at least I found that if you've only worked on sort of new products, sometimes the hiring managers like can't connect the dots and can't see the ways that your skills transfer. So it's again comes back to sort of being also really good at talking about what you do and why you do it and how the kind of discovery work that you're used to doing with new products also translates into kind of a growth environment. But you're right, like BAU maintenance of an established product is totally different than like exponentially disrupting an existing product. I think what's really interesting is trying to figure out like how you can factor in like your most beloved users. So so when you have a new product, like you're talking to users and you're engaging them and you're trying to identify what their problems are and how you might solve it, for example. But nobody's like attached to the solution. Nobody's like attached to your design, right? You just are building something new and you kind of like hope it works. And if it doesn't, you pivot, right? But in the case of an established product, you might have, if you're lucky, you might have like, tens of, thousands of users who are like really happy. And you need to make sure that like, what you're doing doesn't somehow like upset the people that are most passionate about your product. And that's like a problem that I'm definitely like not used to having, and one that someone else had to explain to me.
I think one of the things you mentioned in there is worth exploring a bit of why do you do anything? Whether it's a new product or established product, there must be a reason for you to continue that effort, to put in the money and have a team. Taking 80% of the examples, I'm sure there are exceptions to this rule as well, but most of the time we are investing a whole bunch of effort, time and money and people's emotions into something. And to be able to at least express that takes a bit of work. I know you have this product vision canvas, which is in the Miroverse. I'm sure that helps. You should tell us a few examples of using it as well. And then also being able to take those decisions, kind of type 2 and type 1 decisions. Starting a new product, there's a whole bunch of type 2 decisions. You can revert a lot of things. You can, put out a vision statement. It doesn't resonate. You can step back, and it's a lot easier. Type 1 decisions would be kind of established, almost things that challenge the hierarchy. So how's that? How does that work out for you? How do you get people to see the rationale behind taking certain steps, or getting them to explain that to you?
Yeah, it can be really, really tough. I think I don't know. I mean, a lot of the work that I've done was maybe more strategic in nature. And so I think I've been given a lot more flexibility to try new things and see where it goes and explore in a lot of my jobs, in a way that I wasn't the person who needed to justify and explain all of my decisions to a higher power or to adjacent stakeholders. In a lot of cases, I'm really used to working in these sort of small lean teams where a group of practitioners were kind of tasked to solve a challenging problem without too much description or information or whatever. And that's very freeing, especially to somebody like me. That feels like pure freedom, because all I need to do is talk to people and think critically and try to find new ways to solve problems, or even identify those problems and then come up with solutions. In that environment, the solution part is so such a small sliver of all of the other work that gets done.
Yeah.
And so oftentimes, like, the job is really more about like telling a compelling story than anything else. So it's not so much about like decisions. It's about being able to say, okay, like, we designed the research in this way, and we did this analysis, and we found, the people were saying these kinds of things, and we thought these were 4 different ways that we might solve that problem, and then we brought that to users. And if you can be a good storyteller, which is another good skill for product managers, then I think that for that kind of work, it's a lot less about saying like, we made these decisions for these reasons. It's more about saying like, come on this amazing journey with you, and I'm going to tell you how I learned things and why we learned them, and then how we made decisions. And by the way, we have this solution that's like right over here.
Now that's fascinating. This is one of the things I do a lot with people that I've been coaching, and not just product managers, to kind of get them to that point where they start to recognize that there is a story behind, even if it is not acknowledged. Oftentimes engineers do this a lot, where they kind of they get pigeonholed into this thing of, you don't need to understand the entire picture, somebody else does, and you just do this thing, put this feature over there. And some organizations get into that as well. But one way of getting them out of that is, can you tell a story about it? If you do this, what's going to happen? Is it going to put a smile on somebody's face, or are people going to frown? Are they going to start recommending this product to their friends? And that already starts shifting that mindset.
Yeah, for sure. And by the way, just a small call out here. If you are an engineer listening to this and you work in an org like that, where you end up in a small silo where you're sort of tasked with just delivering things, run away. That's what I have to say, because the truth is that, like, with these things like user research and discovery efforts and solving problems, your engineers like need to be in a room, hearing firsthand what customers are saying, watching them use the products. Otherwise, like, how are they going to make good decisions going forward? The point is that, like, everyone needs to come on that journey with you, all of the functions, because that will enable all of them to work in a more empowered way in order to make the right decisions for those end users. So for me, like, I try to have engineers or different roles like attend the interviews, or at least like record them so that they can watch them back, and they send feedback and we talk it over. And I think being really inclusive like helps.
I think some of my best experiences come from moments where engineers challenged me on certain decisions, and they were right. And kind of, I was lucky that, the first 5 years of my career, I was an engineer, QA engineer, and I also programmed. And then in the last 6, I've been more towards product. So I had gotten enough experience to appreciate this moment, and that it didn't kind of go against my ego. But it was so beautiful to see that, where you can start to rely on your team, like, because we are all human. Someday I will make a mistake. But if I can say, hey, my team is going to stand up and challenge me, and as a result, we're going to do something cool together. Exactly. That's amazing.
And not just challenge you like in a random way or about like an engineering decision, but like challenge you in saying, hey, I watched an interview recently and the user did this thing, and actually I don't think that these designs like satisfy their needs. Like, that is a moment that like warms my little product heart. Like, nothing is better than that.
Absolutely. This reminds me of a UX thing we had like about 5 years ago. We were making some changes to our Here Maps application, and we did some tests. It was one of the early tests, so we were all figuring out how to do this. I'm going to hide some of the details, but essentially what we realized after the test was we were coming to a conclusion where we thought placing the navigation buttons at a certain point wasn't going to be good. But one of the engineers caught this. He got back to us saying, wait a second, I went through the video recordings of the tests, and I noticed in your notes that 3 of the 5 people were Android users, and the mockups we were using were for iOS. No wonder they were confused. And this was such an eye-opening moment, where it was kind of like we followed a lot of the things right. We made sure we were not going to bias the people, but the audience we picked or the mock-ups we used for this audience weren't the right ones. And that was going to lead us to a really absolutely wrong conclusion. And I was so happy that this person was engaged at that moment, that they took the time to actually watch through user interview recordings, which a lot of people don't.
Oh, that's amazing. I've had those experiences before, right? Because especially when you're working on native apps, like, for the sake of saving your designer, oftentimes, your designs either prioritize Android or iOS, and, those systems have like diverging patterns.
Exactly.
Right? And if you're like a diehard Android user, then you're right. iOS doesn't make sense to you and vice versa. And you're right. Like sometimes in those moments, like a product person and a designer maybe don't call that out, but your engineer like might. Or somebody else in the team who's like the other diehard user, right? So if your designs prioritize Android, but you have a bunch of iOS people in your team, then you end up with these kinds of debates. But I've definitely been in a similar position to what you're saying, where I was like very thankful that someone else in the team sort of called out a really, really big thing that I had missed.
Absolutely. And I think we need that engagement, right? Because even going back to the cultural differences, where in US, a lot of people would be very, very on and focused about these things, because this attitude of getting things done together is the driving force. In Europe, people kind of could easily say, well, that's not my job. But I noticed this here as well. Once people are engaged enough, then they might still not respond to an email after work hours, and that's great. I've come to appreciate work-life balance as well. But the next day they will be there and they will talk to you. And perhaps the last topic for today, because we're coming up to our hour, I find it more and more imperative that we talk a lot more about business goals and how they translate into product goals within teams, and kind of just make that front and center, because that is what everything revolves around, right? All the decisions and negotiations we have to make in some way have to get us to a certain goal. And if we lose sight of that, no wonder people will feel dejected and go back to their silos, because there's nothing to go on.
This is a problem that I acutely feel here in Germany. It's not one that I felt before in the US or in Australia, actually. Maybe I got very lucky, but before moving here, I think I had worked in probably more established orgs. And so like talking about company goals and then being able to use those in order to, translate that into sort of a product vision and product goals so that we were driving the right metrics for the business, something I think I took for granted before I came here. And the thing is that, like, at least since coming to Germany, before my role at Onfido, I had largely been working in early stage startups, and oftentimes with like pretty young and green co-founders. And this like isn't meant to sound like a criticism, but in a lot of cases, like, I think those founders were trying to sort of still figure out like where their business was going. But if, as a product person, if you don't know where the business is going, it's very hard to know how to make product decisions. And so what ends up happening, at least from my observation in those scenarios, is that the teams end up becoming very tactical and execution focused, because if you don't know like where you're driving towards, then all you can do is sort of like optimize in this hamster wheel for today. Right. Which means that that's okay at the beginning, like just like you said, sort of like getting started to get started, so that you can sort of like see the next thing, and the next thing is a great way to be, to a point. Because the problem is, like, a lot of what happens is that like then 3 years later, like people pick their heads up and they're like, oh, we're like not getting the traction in the market we expected. What's going on? And it's because like for 3 years, like all the teams did was execute, because they didn't have a good enough view on where, like, what the business goals were and what the company was trying to achieve and what the vision looked like at a company level. And so that sort of like tactical focus kind of had served them to a point, but then like there was a plateau. Like, have you found the same thing? Absolutely. And I don't think it's just a Germany problem. I think it is still a large. I saw this in Singapore, and from what I hear from my friends in other countries in Europe, it is a big problem. Simply because I think there's a bit more history of hierarchical systems here.
US has a very, very interesting history. You know, it's the land of opportunity, and you know, yes, there are differences, and yes, you could be discriminated against still to some extent, but it is still a place that always proclaimed kind of if you worked hard enough and well enough that you could do anything. You know,
Yes.
and that kind of puts you in a different mindset where you are also more easily able to talk about what is good enough. What does that mean? You know, it has a bottom line impact. And as kind of from a European point of view, it might almost sound profane. You know, you're talking about profits and bottom line all the time. But we don't do that over here, let's say. And we kind of give a lot of perhaps sometimes undue respect to authority. We don't question, we don't challenge. But so I 100% agree with you. I noticed that. And I think this is where that moment of kind of communication skills, like what does that mean in practice? In practice, it means I'm able to tell you why we're trying to do a certain thing, and I'm able to tell that story, and I'm able to put it in a way, perhaps especially as a product manager, to say, this is what we hope to achieve as a result of this. You know, there's a certain goal, there's a certain KPI behind it, and there's a certain vision that is guiding us towards that. And this is what I do now with leadership all the time. In every coaching opportunity, it's kind of like, if you guys cannot tell me what your goals are, your team will continue to be kind of operating at a suboptimal level.
Absolutely. I think like one of the best tricks that I learned as a product manager is to kind of like set a time box where you say like, I'm going to like set a date in the future where like I don't have an answer now, but I like need to have an answer by this date, and I'm going to like work towards that date so that then I can give you like the next bit of information, or then I sort of like will need to sort of draw a line in the sand and say I can work up until this point without these things, but at this point I need them. And so trying to sort of like work with management in that way by saying, okay, like this is okay that like we don't have all the answers right now, but at this moment in time, or after we deliver these couple of things, or, you know, whenever it might be, to say, okay, like, let's sort of like agree that we're going to find a way to get the answers by this moment. And it works sometimes. It depends on what the ask is.
Yeah. And there's a context to the certainty, right? You'll probably change your mind with new information. At least you should, if that information is in contradiction to what you have been operating on. So kind of one of the things that I try to tell people, and I'll be very honest again, this is still very hard for people to grasp, to kind of say, this is what we think is the best goal to have in line with our vision. And we're going to revisit it 3 months from now. You know, kind of like I try to bring it as close as possible. It's hard. It's really hard for people in Europe to say, we're not going to talk about the vision 3 months from now. We're going to talk about it next year. And I'm like, are you sure? You know, kind of maybe it takes you 5 minutes. No change. Perfect. But you give the team an opportunity in case somebody has a different view or a question to be able to kind of talk about it and integrate it a bit better. And that's hard for people because it kind of says you might be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, as an American, this is like a very natural place to live. Like, I'm wrong all the time, and I'm totally evolving and changing my perspective and taking in new information and pivoting. But you're right, like, in some other cultures, it's really hard for people to say, like, this first version wasn't the best version, like, let's iterate and things like that. That whole, like, iterative, continuous improvement mindset, like, doesn't exist in all places and with all people. That's for sure true. For me, I think like I've definitely like gotten in the habit of labeling a lot of my work or ideas like with that little like warning sign emoji and labeling things like with like work in progress and saying like, okay, this is just the starting point. This is just the first version. Like we're going to come back to it and we're going to see if we were right. And if we weren't right, we're going to, you know, make moves, and that's totally fine. And trying to sort of like be really upfront, and the emoji helps, honestly. Like that little fun emoji, like it goes a long way as a communication mechanism and sort of like, I don't know, softening that blow that it's like, okay, that we don't have to be perfect on the first try.
I think that's a perfect sentence to bring this talk to a close. Would you want to give some advice to any budding product managers out there?
I know I've said this before, I've said it twice already during this podcast, but it's okay if you don't live in empowered teams land and that your company isn't the ideal setup for product people, especially when you're early days in your career. There's still plenty of opportunities for you to learn and grow and have a sphere of influence inside your organization. So hang in there and take the learnings where you can.
Perfect. Merissa, thank you so much for your time. I'm sure we're going to have many more conversations because there's a lot of detail that we didn't go into. I wish you a productive day.
Same to you. Thanks very much for having me. This is an absolute pleasure.
Ciao, everybody.
Bye.